That frozen pizza sitting in your freezer right now, the one you pull out on a busy weeknight when nobody in the house has the energy to actually cook a real meal. The one that says 100% real mozzarella or made with real cheese right there on the box in bold, confident letters designed specifically to catch your eye as you walk past that freezer case. You assumed that meant something simple and honest. Cheese is cheese, melted, stretchy, that same satisfying pull you get from a fresh slice at your favorite local pizza place. That assumption, the one nearly every shopper walks in with, is exactly what the frozen food industry has been quietly counting on for decades now. Here is what almost nobody standing in that frozen aisle actually knows. There is a legal category in the United States called imitation cheese and a separate legal category called cheese analog, and food companies are fully allowed to use either one on a frozen pizza without ever putting the word imitation anywhere on the front of the box, as long as the ingredient list printed on the back technically discloses what's actually inside that blend. Real mozzarella, the traditional version, is milk, live cultures, rennet, and salt, nothing more complicated than that. Cheese analog, by contrast, can be made primarily from water, vegetable oil, modified food starch, and casein, a milk-derived protein that lets a company still legally claim the finished product contains dairy without the product actually being cheese in any meaningful traditional sense of that word. It melts under heat, it stretches when you pull a slice. It looks essentially identical sitting under the bright lights of a grocery store freezer case display, and on a genuinely large percentage of frozen pizzas sold across America right now. That blend is exactly what's sitting on top of the crust before it ever touches the oven. We pulled the ingredient labels off 10 of the biggest frozen pizza brands sold across the entire country, the ones sitting in nearly every grocery store freezer section from coast to coast. We read every single line printed on every single box. No skimming past the fine print, no simply trusting the glossy photo of melted cheese printed across the front of the packaging. Some of what we found is completely standard for the frozen food industry and entirely legal in every technical sense under current food labeling regulations. Some of it is genuinely surprising given exactly how several of these brands choose to market themselves to health-conscious and quality-focused shoppers. By the end of this video, you are going to flip every single frozen pizza box over before it ever goes into your cart again. We are counting down from the least concerning entry to the most concerning, and at the very end I will give you 3 brands that are actually using real mozzarella. No substitutes, no shortcuts, nothing hidden in the fine print. Let's get into it. Number 10. DiGiorno Rising Crust Pepperoni. DiGiorno built its entire brand identity around one now famous advertising slogan. It's not delivery, it's DiGiorno, a direct and deliberate challenge to actual local pizzerias, positioning the product as close enough to genuinely fresh delivered pizza that you could serve it to guests at a party without anyone in the room noticing much of a difference at all. The cheese blend on DiGiorno's classic rising crust line does list mozzarella cheese as a primary ingredient right near the top of the list, which genuinely puts this brand ahead of several competitors we will get to further down this countdown. But look a little closer and you will also find modified food starch listed, along with a small amount of cellulose, a plant-based fiber commonly used industry-wide as an anti-caking agent specifically to keep shredded cheese from clumping together during the freezing and long-distance shipping process. Cellulose itself is not inherently concerning in the small amounts typically used. It shows up across the entire shredded cheese industry broadly, even in ordinary bags of shredded cheese sold at your local deli counter. But its presence here does mean what's actually melting on your pizza is real mozzarella blended with functional processing aids added in, not the simple traditional 4-ingredient cheese a small independent pizzeria down the street would typically use behind the counter. Number 9. Tombstone Frozen Pizza. Tombstone markets itself around a rugged, no-nonsense identity built specifically for hearty toppings and a thick, generous layer of cheese, positioned deliberately for people who want genuine substance on their pizza over anything fancy, delicate, or overly elevated in presentation. Tombstone's printed ingredient list includes a cheese blend combining mozzarella with a smaller percentage of what's officially labeled as a pasteurized processed cheese product, a distinct regulatory category separate from natural cheese that involves additional emulsifiers and stabilizing agents, specifically to help the overall blend melt more uniformly across a mass-produced pie that ultimately gets baked in home ovens running at wildly different actual temperatures across millions of different kitchens nationwide. It's not full cheese analog in the strictest technical sense, Real dairy cheese still makes up the clear majority of that blend by weight, but the added processed cheese component does mean the melt you're actually watching happen in your oven has been specifically engineered for manufacturing consistency across a factory production line, rather than optimized purely for flavor the way a fresh ball of mozzarella naturally would be. Number 8. Red Baron Frozen Pizza. Red Baron leans heavily into a classic old-school pizzeria feel throughout its branding, red and white checkered packaging design reminiscent of a traditional Italian-American restaurant, a brand that has been sitting in essentially the same freezer aisle position for decades now without dramatically changing its core visual identity over that time. Red Baron's ingredient list shows a strikingly similar pattern to Tombstone's formulation, a mozzarella and processed cheese blend combined together, along with modified food starch listed specifically to help control excess moisture during the baking process so the crust underneath doesn't turn soggy or fall apart from all that melted cheese sitting on top as it cooks. That specific starch addition represents a functional trade-off many major frozen pizza brands have made deliberately, because a home oven reheating a frozen pie from a cold freezer state behaves very differently from a live flame commercial pizza oven cooking fresh dough in 90 seconds flat, and the entire cheese formulation gets carefully adjusted specifically to survive that longer, slower home baking process without breaking down or separating into a greasy mess. Number 7. Freschetta Frozen Pizza. Freschetta has spent years carefully positioning itself as the more premium, more artisanal option available in the frozen pizza aisle, offering a noticeably thicker crust, more generous toppings, and packaging deliberately designed to feel like it belongs closer to an actual restaurant menu than a standard supermarket freezer case. Freschetta's 4 cheese and classic product lines do list a genuine mozzarella and provolone blend as the primary cheese source used, which is a real meaningful point in the brand's favor worth stating clearly. But several of its specialty and value-focused varieties sold under that exact same Freschetta brand name at a noticeably lower price point on the same shelf quietly swap in a considerably higher percentage of cheese analog ingredients, including vegetable oil and casein, without any real change to the outer packaging design that would clearly signal to an average shopper that they're actually buying a meaningfully different, lower-quality cheese formulation than the flagship premium product sitting directly next to it on that same shelf. Number 6. Totino's Party Pizza. Totino's is built around a very specific target audience: kids, college dorm rooms, late-night snacking sessions, backed by an extremely low retail price point that makes it consistently one of the cheapest frozen pizzas sold anywhere across the entire country. At that rock-bottom price point, the printed ingredient list reflects exactly what a reasonable person would expect going in. The cheese topping lists a blend that does include mozzarella cheese somewhere in the mix, but alongside a significant portion of what's simply labeled as cheese product, a much broader regulatory category that legally allows for considerably more vegetable oil content, more modified starch, and more added water than natural cheese would ever contain on its own, specifically because that broader category allows the manufacturer to hit an extremely low retail shelf price while still technically legally using the word cheese somewhere prominently on the label. Totino's has never really marketed itself as a premium or artisanal product in the first place, so there's a reasonable argument that the formulation genuinely matches the honest promise being made. But most shoppers, especially parents specifically buying this product for their kids' after-school snacks, likely still assume cheese pizza means real cheese regardless of what the actual price tag on the box happens to say. Number 5. Jack's Frozen Pizza. Jack's positions itself as a straightforward, no-frills budget option, similar in overall spirit and positioning to Tombstone, marketed heavily through aggressive value pricing and a simple, deliberately unpretentious brand identity built around affordability above everything else. Jack's printed ingredient list does include a cheese blend where mozzarella cheese is clearly listed as an ingredient, but it appears after water and vegetable oil in the actual ingredient order printed on several of its most popular varieties, and food labeling regulations require every ingredient on a package to be listed strictly in descending order by total weight. That specific ordering means, purely by federal labeling regulation, that water and vegetable oil together make up a genuinely larger percentage of that particular cheese topping by weight than the actual mozzarella itself does, even though the word mozzarella still appears prominently in the product description and directly on the front of the box where shoppers actually look first. Number 4. Amy's Frozen Cheese Pizza, a brand that markets itself specifically around organic ingredients and a vegetarian-friendly overall positioning, sold at a noticeably higher price point than the mass-market brands covered earlier in this countdown, specifically targeting health-conscious shoppers who are genuinely willing to pay more for what they reasonably assume is a meaningfully cleaner product across the entire package. Amy's does genuinely use real organic mozzarella as its primary cheese source across its core lineup, which is a real legitimate point in its favor worth stating clearly and directly. However, plenty of shoppers reasonably but mistakenly assume that because a brand emphasizes organic certification broadly across its overall identity and marketing, every single formulation choice across the entire product line automatically follows that same strict standard, when in reality organic certification specifically addresses how the milk-producing cows were raised and what they were fed during that process, not whether the finished cheese itself has subsequently been blended with any additional processing aids afterward. Amy's own ingredient list does include a small amount of modified cornstarch in some of its varieties, clearly disclosed right there on the label if you look closely, but genuinely easy to miss entirely if you're shopping primarily on brand reputation and trust alone, rather than actually reading every single line printed on the back. Number 3. Screaming Sicilian Frozen Pizza. A newer entrant into this crowded category marketed heavily around bold, edgy branding, and a slightly more premium, more youthful identity than the legacy brands that have dominated this same freezer aisle for decades without much real competition until recently. The brand does list mozzarella cheese as a primary ingredient across its core standard lineup, which deserves credit. But several of its specialty varieties, particularly the ones featuring extra cheese or a stuffed crust design heavily marketed and promoted across social media platforms, include a secondary cheese product blend listed clearly after the primary mozzarella in the ingredient order, meaning the extra cheese you're specifically paying a premium price for, precisely because the packaging emphasizes it so heavily in its marketing, is disproportionately more likely to actually be the cheaper analog blend rather than genuinely additional real mozzarella added on top. If you've made it this far into the list, you're probably already thinking hard about exactly which box is currently sitting in your own freezer right now. Subscribe to Consumer Alert right now, because we do exactly this kind of deep dive every single week, pulling apart ingredient labels brand by brand, so you never have to stand there yourself in a cold grocery aisle squinting at fine print while other shoppers wait behind you with their carts. We have 2 more entries left to go, and the next one might genuinely surprise you if it's a brand you've been buying specifically because you assumed it was cheaper but essentially the same product as the name brand sitting right next to it. Number 2. Store brand and private label frozen pizzas sold under nearly every major grocery chain's own house name. The ones consistently priced noticeably below the name brand competitors sitting right next to them on that exact same shelf, positioned deliberately as essentially the same product for meaningfully less money out of your pocket. This is really more of a broad category than any single named brand. These private label pizzas are typically manufactured by third-party co-packing companies who produce products simultaneously for multiple different retailers at once, using whichever specific cheese formulation happens to hit the exact price point that particular retailer has negotiated for that specific product line ahead of time. Ingredient lists genuinely vary significantly from one store chain to another even when the outer packaging design looks nearly identical to the untrained eye. And several private label frozen pizzas tested independently by consumer research groups over the years have shown cheese blends weighted more heavily toward cheese analog than their name brand equivalents sitting right next to them, precisely because the retailer's primary negotiating priority throughout that entire process is hitting a lower shelf price point, not necessarily matching any specific cheese quality standard along the way. Number 1. Ultra-value multi-pack frozen pizzas sold at dollar stores and the very deepest discount shelves of major grocery chains, typically several individual pizzas bundled together for a total price that works out to just a couple of dollars per pie once you do the math. At that rock-bottom price point, real mozzarella is essentially not economically possible to include as the primary cheese topping, and the printed ingredient lists on these specific products confirm exactly that reality without much ambiguity. Water and vegetable oil listed as the very first ingredients in the cheese topping breakdown, followed by modified food starch, casein, and only a small percentage of actual mozzarella, or in some cases no natural cheese content at all, which remains fully legally permitted under the imitation cheese or cheese analog regulatory category, as long as the front of the box never explicitly claims the words real or 100% cheese. Specific language. These particular budget brands are notably careful to avoid printing anywhere on their packaging for exactly this reason. That is the full list, 10 brands, one single pattern repeating itself over and over again underneath nearly every entry on this entire countdown. Ingredient order that quietly reveals water and oil actually outweigh the cheese itself by total weight. Processed cheese and cheese analog regulatory categories that legally let a company use the word cheese on a package without it meaning what an ordinary shopper naturally assumes it means when they see it. And premium-sounding branding printed across the front of a box that frequently has little to no real relationship with what's actually melting on top of your pizza once you finally pull it out of the oven at home. Before we get to what's actually genuinely worth buying, here is something you can go do with the box already sitting in your own freezer right now, tonight, without needing any lab equipment or special certification at all. Start with the ingredient order test. Flip the box over in your hands and find the specific cheese topping ingredient breakdown listed on the back panel. If mozzarella cheese is listed first, appearing before water, vegetable oil or starch in that particular list, that's a genuinely good sign worth noting. If water or vegetable oil appears before mozzarella anywhere in that specific ingredient list, the product legally contains more water and oil by total weight than actual cheese, regardless of whatever the front of the box happens to visually imply through its glossy photography. Then run the melt test yourself at home. Real mozzarella, when properly melted under heat, browns unevenly across the surface, forms distinct individual bubbles as it cooks, and pulls into long, uneven strings when you lift a single slice away from the pie. Cheese analog, by contrast, tends to melt into a flatter, noticeably more uniform layer across the entire surface, browns more evenly overall because its fat content is more chemically consistent than natural dairy cheese, and often ends up with a slightly rubbery, noticeably less stretchy texture once it cools down even a little bit on the plate. Finally, run the label language test carefully. Look specifically for the word imitation, or the exact phrase cheese product, appearing anywhere on the packaging, even if it's tucked into small print you'd normally skip right past. Companies are legally required to disclose this information somewhere on the package, even if it's deliberately not placed on the front where you'd notice it immediately while shopping. The complete absence of the standalone word cheese, replaced instead with softer-sounding phrases like cheese blend, cheese topping, or cheese product, is itself a meaningful signal worth paying close attention to before that box ever goes into your cart. Now 3 brands that are actually using real mozzarella, no substitutes hidden in the fine print, no shortcuts quietly built into the formulation. The first good pick is Amy's Organic Cheese Pizza. Despite the modified cornstarch note mentioned earlier in this list, the primary cheese source used across this brand's entire lineup remains genuine organic mozzarella, and the overall ingredient list stays considerably shorter and far more recognizable than nearly every mass-market competitor covered on this countdown. It does cost more per pizza than the value-focused brands sitting nearby on the shelf. That real price difference genuinely reflects actual dairy content doing the work, rather than water and vegetable oil quietly doing it instead behind the scenes. The second good pick is Whole Foods' 365 brand cheese pizza, which clearly lists mozzarella cheese as the unambiguous primary ingredient, with no processed cheese or cheese analog blend appearing anywhere in the printed topping breakdown. Whole Foods has historically maintained noticeably stricter ingredient standards across its entire private label product line compared to most mainstream grocery chains applying to their own house store brands, and this particular frozen pizza line reflects that same consistent standard throughout. The third good pick, and honestly the single most reliable option of all on this entire list, is simply buying a fresh ball of real mozzarella from the deli or dairy section of your grocery store and building your own frozen pizza at home to keep on hand for busy weeknights. Store-bought dough, or a pre-made crust, a simple can of crushed tomatoes, fresh mozzarella torn apart by hand, and whatever toppings you personally prefer, assembled together and frozen on a sheet pan before being transferred into a freezer bag for long-term storage. The total ingredient cost here comes out to genuinely less than most mid-tier frozen pizza brands sold at the store. And you will know, with complete and total certainty, that what's actually melting on top when it comes out of your oven is real cheese, nothing else hidden underneath a glossy marketing label. Here is the one rule genuinely worth keeping every single time you find yourself standing in that freezer aisle deciding what to buy. Flip the box before it ever goes into your cart. Find the specific cheese topping ingredient list printed on the back, and check carefully what comes first in that order. If it's not mozzarella listed right at the top, Ask yourself honestly what exactly you're actually paying for when you get to the register. If this changed the way you'll shop for something as simple and ordinary as a frozen pizza, hit the like button right now before you scroll away, and tell me down in the comments which specific brand was sitting in your freezer before you started watching this video. Subscribe to Consumer Alert so you catch it every single time we open up another label that nobody else out there is actually bothering to read closely enough. Stay sharp, read the back of the box before you ever trust the front of it, and I'll see you in the next one.